I'm very happy to introduce our third plenary speaker today. Our speaker is Tracie Baker. She's an associate professor in the Department of Environmental and Global Health at the University of Florida. She's also an adjunct faculty in the Institute of Environmental Health Sciences and Department of Pharmacology in the School of Medicine at Wayne State University in Detroit. Her lab focuses on multidisciplinary translational research that bridges human, animal, and environmental health. She provides critical insights into environmentally induced disease by evaluating contaminant levels in global environments and using the zebrafish model to uncover the etiology of adverse health endpoints related to contaminant exposure. Tracie earned her BS in biology and chemistry at Cleveland State University and MS in marine biology at the University of Alaska, and a doctorate of veterinary medicine and PhD in molecular and environmental toxicology at the University of Wisconsin. Her talk today is environmental contamination through a One Health lens. And Tracie, it's all yours.
All right, thank you, Carol, for that great introduction. Let me just get oriented here for a second. All right. And thank you for the organizers for inviting me to speak here today. It's great to be back at IAGLR. It's been a few years since I've been here. Carol and I were privileged enough to chair a session bright and early Tuesday morning on PFAS. And we had a great turnout, amazing speakers, especially some of our new investigators and trainees, and great discussions. And I've seen that kind of emphasized throughout this whole meeting. Also great to catch up with many of you and learn more about your research. So as I was thinking about the theme of this conference, Shared Lakes, One Water, One Health, which recognizes these connections between the environment, people, and animals. And this includes plants and animals, both domestic as well as wildlife. So One Health is thus, by definition, collaborative, multi-sectorial, transdisciplinary, including veterinary, human, medical, public health, biomedical, environmental, agricultural, wildlife professionals, and so many more. In my own research, as Carol mentioned, I'm a veterinarian as well as a PhD in environmental toxicologist by training, and I use the zebrafish model to look and translate a number of health outcomes to zebrafish, or to humans. So I try to stay as much as I can kind of in the middle of this triad. However, One Health has been commonly considered and employed for infectious disease. Touched something. One Health has most commonly been considered and employed for infectious disease and biomedical research, kind of bridging human and domestic animal health. Also commonly environmental and human health. And as a result, rarely are all the relevant sectors of the One Health triad engaged in particularly project or effort. So the One Health perspective can often be overlooked in many cases where it may be valuable. But it's not a new concept. It's been around actually for quite a while. But over the last few decades, there has been this increase in awareness and traction in this approach. And so as I prepared for this talk, I was reflecting on why that might be. And I think that this is due to human-induced stressors around the globe, and as well as technological advances. And therefore, we're facing these wicked problems, both in personal and our professional lives. So this phrase has also been, I think, used a lot more lately, wicked problems. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what those are. because it's often not necessarily defined. So it's not, wicked problems have nothing to do with Disney or musicals, or even include a witch. They're actually multi-dimensional, interconnected, and complex societal and environmental challenges that can't really even be solved, rather potentially resolved using multiple different ways, each of which have different costs as well as benefits. So the term wicked is not intended as a moral sense like evil. Instead, it basically is considered more difficult to address than a benign problem, which can still be complicated, but tend to have a clear solution or a clear method for solving the problem. For example, using a traditional scientific method to, within a high degree of certainty, be able to figure out the structure of an unknown compound. Another example of the contrast between wicked and benign problems is depicted here on this slide. As students were primarily faced with benign problems within academic setting, i.e. assignments with clear guidelines, known requirements, and correct solutions. In this way, traditional education has not really prepared us for approaching these wicked problems. For example, running a country in which solutions tend to be unclear and there are disagreements over the outcomes. So besides the pictures that I've already showed and running a country, there are so many other examples of these wicked problems. For example, all the drivers of biodiversity loss, so habitat loss, invasive species, infectious disease, pollution, climate change, overharvest, overexploitation, a lot of the things that a number of us are studying. And then in our personal lives, social media and mental health, security, privacy, and digital technologies, health, gender, and racial equality, water availability, food security, poverty, fossil fuel dependence, and a number more. So there are several key characteristics of these wicked problems. Think about some examples that were just mentioned or other problems that you study and that concern you. So wicked problems can't be solved by science or policy by itself. They're unique and they're difficult to define. They're interdependent, they're multi-causal, meaning every wicked problem often points to another wicked problem, and that is, they're kind of basing or circular in some ways. They offer no clear solution, no ability for trial and error, and so a lot of times we have to implement decisions and not really knowing all the costs and benefits. They don't have a clear right and wrong solution. It's kind of like a better and worse. And in fact, any proposed solution to a wicked problem often, as I said, tends to create another wicked problem. They're socially complex and they can be explained in multiple ways. So, and how a person chooses to explain these is often based on their worldview and values, which typically then affects how the problem will be approached and even possibly solved. For example, how climate change is resolved by those with an entirely scientific worldview versus an entirely religious worldview. Another thing that they have in common is that resolving a wicked problem almost always involves a need for a change in behavior. And as Albert Einstein stated, we can't solve our problems, including these wicked problems, with the same thinking that we use to create them. So addressing these wicked problems thus necessitates effective collaboration, communication across multiple perspectives. So this is where the One Health framework comes in and is useful in approaching these problems because it is already inherently transdisciplinary as well as team-based. So specifically, One Health is integrated, unifying approach that mobilizes multiple sectors, disciplines, and communities at varying levels of society to work together and to foster well-being and tackle threats to health as well as to the ecosystems while addressing this large collective need for healthy food, good water, energy, air, and taking action on climate change and contributing to a sustainable development. So there's so many examples about how environmental changes are affecting wildlife. Just for some examples, due to climate change, to loss of habitat, contaminants. And these factors are affecting humans and their health directly due to consumption of water and wildlife, as well as interacting with water. So it's affecting both the wildlife in and of itself and humans in and of itself, and then there's this connection. So here are some pictures that we took last week of so many people fishing right downstream of the mouth of the Rouge River, which most of us or a lot of us know is highly industrialized and very polluted. We know that there's a large amount of toxicants that are in the fish, and that varies based on the species, and that the health and effects of humans can also vary based on age, genetics, and other health factors. So as you can see from this example of a One Health problem, the intersection between human, animal, and the environment is super complex. And working through these complex problems and finding solutions requires knowledge from many disciplines, probably more than's written here. In other words, genuinely healthy, sustainable, and equitable human health and sociological systems requires transdisciplinary approach. But are these transdisciplinary approaches actually effective for these wicked problems? As we know, the world is now so complex that no one person, no one discipline, or no one sector has the skills and knowledge to solve these huge problems. In fact, these problems are the major incentive for developing transdisciplinary research, which is inherently open-minded approach requiring collaboration as well as communication. And so you might be thinking, a lot of these disciplinary words have been used more and more. And so how does transdisciplinary, what does it mean? And how is it different from some of these other multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary? So multidisciplinary means that people from different disciplines are working together in parallel to approach the problem, each drawing on their own disciplinary knowledge. Whereas interdisciplinary means integrating knowledge and methods from different disciplinaries using synthesis of methods to approach this problem. And then transdisciplinary means creating new intellectual framework concepts and methods that transcend these disciplinary boundaries to actually solve the problem. And increasingly includes knowledge systems, and these knowledge systems can be held by local as well as indigenous communities. So as it turns out, the type of open-minded, collaborative, and communicative approach requires an effective team. Is anyone familiar with Google's Project Aristotle? So this was a 4-year study to determine the characteristics of an effective team. And the name is based, as you probably guessed, on a quote written by Aristotle that's commonly quoted as "the whole is greater than the sum of the parts." The study surveyed 50,000 people over 180 teams and looked at over 100 different variables. And I'm sure you've all been on both effective and unfortunately ineffective teams. And just think about if you were able to figure out or determine what made one of these teams more effective and not the other. So for Project Aristotle, the 100 variables assessed range from individual characteristics like extroversion and seniority to group dynamics, like if people socialized outside of the team or if they shared certain hobbies, the size of the team, etc. Interestingly, far and away, the variable that was the most important was not socializing outside of the team and shared hobbies like I thought that it would be. It was psychological safety. So psychological safety refers to individuals' perception of the consensus of taking an interpersonal risk, or a belief that the team is safe for risk-taking in the face of being seen as ignorant, incompetent, negative, or disruptive. So a team with high psychological safety, teammates feel safe to take risks around their team members. They feel confident that no one on the team will embarrass them or punish them or anyone else for admitting a mistake or asking a question or offering a new idea. So now looking back at those effective versus ineffective teams, does this resonate with your experience? I hope that we'll all foster these qualities in our future teams, which again is essential for implementing this transdisciplinary and One Health research. So is there evidence that effective team has better results? Yes, studies have shown that effective teams tend to innovate faster, see mistakes more quickly, find better solutions to problems. Studies have also shown that people working in these teams tend to achieve better results and also report higher job satisfaction. So also remember that a productive transdisciplinary approach requires open-minded, cross-disciplinary information exchange, which can serve as a starting point for a number of things listed here. So framing better questions. So a key to getting better answers is to ask better questions. By considering a fuller set of perspectives and tools, we can frame questions that are not apparent from data and tools of just a single discipline. We can also gather and assess more relevant and comprehensive data, include diverse types of data and multiple modes of assessment, and can clarify what this additional data is most needed to advance the understanding on a given topic, potential interventions, or a solution. Advance knowledge more effectively and develop more effective interventions as well as solutions. So let's use an example of lead exposure in children, which is the result of a chemical exposure, social determinants of health, genetics, engineering of the built environment, and educational strategies. So what good is an educational intervention, if the child is still exposed to lead because the built environment is not properly remediated or the source of the exposure remains unidentified? So the most effective solutions to lead exposure in children is this synergistic combination of educational, environmental, social, as well as medical interventions. So there are definite advantages to transdisciplinary approach, which we all likely already knew. But to be honest, it can be really difficult, and there can be challenges as well. One major challenge is the unbiased ownership, with a dominance of scientists, both natural and social, driving the process, and limited involvement of non-academic participants, particularly in problem identification, as well as project development, and conflicting viewpoints over methods, especially between academic and non-academic participants. These challenges highlight a gulf between academic and non-academic sectors, and the gulf is increasingly recognized as negatively impacting these problems, especially wicked problems and their progress. The gulf also explains the increasing importance of community-based approaches, which I will circle back to in a few minutes. All right, so an example of our own work using transdisciplinary and One Health approaches. We just were fortunate enough to start our 7th field season last week for the evaluation of contaminants of emerging concern in the Huron to Erie corridor. This includes PFAS, pesticides, pharmaceuticals, personal care products, and now microplastics. So at first, this started with water and sediment in the Huron to Erie corridor. Here you can see a map of some of the sites that we've looked at, basically starting up in Lake Huron all the way down to Lake Erie. This map specifically is PFAS that is in the river sediment. And looking at this corridor over these 7 years, we've looked at changes in season, as well as from year to year, changes in rainfall. And we've looked at between 6 sites some years and up to 22 sites in other years. And a few years ago, we also added looking at the Rouge River because we knew that was a very considerable tributary to the work that we were doing. And so we looked at the middle and the lower Rouge. Again, this specifically is sediment samples. And here's a look at total PFAS, kind of in the Rouge, lower and middle Rouge. And you can see that obviously this is an important tributary with a high PFAS load as we're entering into the Detroit River, which I mentioned earlier was very industrialized as well as polluted. And here we are last week. This is Mallory, a PhD student that works in my lab. She was up here with me taking samples. And this is us doing a microplastic sample right in the mouth of the Rouge River where it connects with the Detroit River. And you can see from this image that the industrialization that's around there. In 2021, we added non-lethal sampling of blood and muscle of fish to multiple sites, again, within the same corridor. So as part of the One Health process, we were very interested in defining and integrating a non-lethal type of analysis. So we're taking muscle biopsies and blood samples from multiple trophic levels of fish and comparing them. We were able to see that at least PFAS, which we have more data on, but we're looking at all of these contaminants in these fish species, that it is bioaccumulating as well as by magnifying up trophic levels. We've also started looking at antibiotic resistance as well as microbiome changes and again, microplastics. And you can see that everyone looks pretty happy in these pictures, even though some years we were in our Mustang suits and freezing out there. So all of these, not only are affecting fish health, but as I mentioned, can also affect human health. So through these experiences, we've also learned the importance of community-based approaches. So these are just some of the collaborators that have helped with this large-scale project. U.S. Fish and Wildlife has been integral in all of the 7 years. We go out on their boats, take samples, help put the gill nets out. And then as part of our idea for non-lethal sampling, they've organized a lot of their survey work around the research that we're doing. So as they're doing surveys, they bring the fish of interest back to us at the dock. As you can see in some of those other pictures, we're able to do these quick surgeries, recover the fish and release them. So there's, it would be very difficult, maybe impossible to do this kind of study without their help. Also, the Friends of the Rouge were integral in the part where we were obviously looking at the contaminants in the Rouge River and, have also been great partners. Friends of the Detroit River, the Waterkeepers Association, as well as Healthy Urban Waters and Carol Miller, who is the co-investigator on this project with me for funding, the Herb Family Foundation, which has supported a lot of this work and continues to support it, as well as the Great Lakes Water Authority, and the many academic collaborators and analysis labs that have helped with this. Just to briefly mention a few of our other projects that are similar. About a year and a half ago, I was part of a 4-person team I was the scientist on that team where we took a 7-day canoe expedition across the Everglades. So we started in the Gulf of Mexico, canoed, and took microplastic samples, PFAS, personal care products, looked for antibiotic resistance over this very pristine, going from pristine area all the way to Miami and out into the Atlantic Ocean. And so crossing this huge breadth of land and just seeing the interactions again with people. This water is used for a huge amount of Florida. The water's coming from other parts of Florida as it's being drained. And there's obviously a lot of wildlife in these areas. And what we found were that at every site, even the most pristine where we basically were canoeing for 4 days and not seeing a person, we found microplastics and PFAS, as well as some antibiotics and personal care products. And here's me using, again, that same microplastics net out in the Everglades. And just the last project of ours that I'll talk about, which is again similar, is a project that we did in Ethiopia last summer, where we were looking at an area that doesn't have a lot of water and water resources, especially certain times of year, but does have a lot of agriculture, specifically of a certain cash crop, and a lot of pesticides are being used. So using or looking at a number of different lakes and rivers and wells, looking at these pesticides with stakeholders and collaborators from the area, and trying to see kind of what's out there and what the health effects might be due to this. So in each of these projects, as I mentioned, we're starting to employ these community-based approaches. There's multiple levels of community-based approaches. On the left end of the spectrum, depicted here is what you would most accurately call a community-targeted approach. So this is very limited engagement in the community, other than providing some information. It's really in one direction. So usually this is academics relaying their information to a community. So a true community-based approach is when the community is engaged through the whole process. So consultation and involvement in the problem, identification, project development. In other words, communication becomes bi-directional between academics and the community. And more, fortunately, community engagement is tending toward the right end of the spectrum, known as community-based or community-partnered participatory approach, which the community is engaged. And community engaged not only the problem, but also the data collection and application, and more advancing the knowledge and solutions and interventions that result from this data integration. In other words, not only is it biodirectional communication, but also shared decision-making and mutual ownership of the process and products of this approach. So when done properly, these community-based approaches create bridges between academics and communities, and it aims to create positive, transformative, sustainable changes together for and in communities using a framework with characteristics outlined here. So is there evidence that this community-based research works? Yes, there is. And there is for a lot of the reasons that I've already talked about. But like transdisciplinary approaches, this also has its challenges. The demands of academic research, and such as like including a control group in many study designs may not be trusted or tolerated by some communities. And researchers might not be able or willing to accommodate, the exact needs and wants of the community. There's also potential for a power imbalance to occur between researchers and members of the community. For example, it's unclear how the community is supposed to evaluate the credibility of academic participants. In fact, evidence has shown that In such situations, that community members largely rely on whether a person looks or sounds or acts like a credible expert. And so obviously this method has a serious flaw compared to actually assessing the skills and experience and resources available. There's an additional potential for a power imbalance between community members themselves. For example, the individuals who are not eligible or who elect not to be part of one of these projects, they can find that their ties to the community are weakened and their voice in the community they can feel is marginalized. Finally, there's a greater risk for bias in the recruitment compared to traditional approaches in which randomization usually would occur. So to avoid these types of challenges, careful planning and discussions and shared decision-making is essential before engaging community-based approaches. So back to our question of whether these approaches are effective. So yes, they do seem to be very effective, and it's a step in the right direction, maybe for resolving rather than solving these complex problems. Other useful tools for approaching complex problem systems is systems thinking, often employed in the One Health framework. I am not an expert in systems thinking. I'm still learning a lot about it, but I thought I should mention it here because it is becoming a great tool. And if you are interested, be good to learn more about it. So what is a system? A system can be an ecosystem, it can be a community, it can be an individual organism, an organization, a hospital, a car, something or more dispersed like wildlife trade or climate change, supply chain, educational system, a healthcare system. And so systems thinking is useful for understanding the relationships between the parts of a whole and how these parts function as a whole. So systems thinking is a way of approaching problems that asks how various parts within a system influence each other, and that looks at patterns over time and seeks to look for the root causes. So basically, it allows you in a multi-factor and complex system to tweak one variable and see what happens in the chain of events and how that feedback loops and either exacerbates or changes or causes, help solve the problem. So just very quickly, one common tool in the system thinking is called management flight simulation. This provides computer-based simulation in which the decision makers can learn from an experience in a controlled setting. Another is causal loop diagrams. This is a different tool used in system thinking that helps us visualize the interrelationships within these systems. So if you want to think in systems, we need to change our linear way of thinking and like cause and effect without any feedback. And since everything is interconnected, there is constant feedback loops. So the take-home messages are your health and the health of family, community, animals are connected, and are connected to the environment. So be a good steward of all three. As I mentioned, no one person, profession, or academic discipline or sector can tackle these modern complex problem alone. We need to foster psychological safety, dependability, and structure in our teams. Modern complex problems, they're not untouchable. So we can think, oh, this is so big, there's nothing that we can do. There are tools to advance understanding and potential resolutions at varying leverage points. Successful change requires engagement to common causes as well as actions. And big changes and comprehensive reform often start very small. So attend workshops, do CE on system-based thinking and some of these other tools, as well as consider how they work, and how they can bridge in all parts in the One Health triad. And more importantly, even though these are major problems, there are tools and there is hope. So I just want to end with a quote from Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave who became a prominent activist of abolition of slavery and racial equality. So to paraphrase, progress of human liberty and freedom inherently requires a struggle. And, things feel hard and things feel messy right now, but that actually is a necessary step toward progress. So I also want to quickly just thank the amazing people that work in my lab and that I get to work with every day, as well as the people that I've worked with over time and my funding agencies. Also, if you want to contact me or if you have any questions and you're not able to ask them now, feel free to contact me by email or reach out. So with that, I think we might have time for some questions now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tracie. Are there any questions? We still have a few minutes before we break up for lunch. And I can bring probably a microphone out to you. If you have a question, please just raise your hand. All right, I have a question. So how were you able to do everything in the field this week? I know you were out on the water. I know you have 2 kids you're keeping track of. You have family you're visiting, and yet you were able to get ready for this and put together this wonderful presentation. Tell me about the teamwork?
Yeah, many hands. Surprised I'm still standing at the moment. Plan to take a really long nap after this, but yeah, so many great people have been helpful with this. Seemed like a great idea to try to combine everything into one trip. Maybe lessons learned.
And I should have said 3 kids. I'm standing back there thinking I can't keep track of my own kids. So how do I know? She's got 3. Anyhow, any questions regarding Tracie's presentation? Right here.
Thanks for a very interesting presentation. And I know you couldn't go into depth in a lot of it, but I wonder if you could, using the example of your study in Ethiopia, just really briefly about applying those very specific things, like, for example, engaging with the community ahead of time and following up, that sort of thing. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, and we were, in order to do a lot of these things, having these partnerships ahead of time, building on partnerships and collaborations that are already there. So part of this project was the University of Florida and a number of other universities, both within the U.S. and other places, are working on some of these major problems, looking at liver disease in 35-year-olds, high increase of breast cancer, neural tube defects in this specific region. So yeah, being able to reach out, we have a collaboration with institutions as well as with other stakeholders within Ethiopia, and I think that is the most important thing. Again, having this community-based approach and being able to talk among the groups and among the teams ahead of time, and to really hear their voices and their concerns, as well as issues that we might run into and things we should think about. And I think that only helps build the team and help the research.
Thank you so much, Tracie. I see another question.
I've been aware of One Health for a long time. I'm just wondering, but I don't know the history of it. Could you tell us a bit about that, where it started and where it's been and where it's going?
Sure. Yeah, I should have put my timeline up here then. Yeah, so basically, I mean, it started, I guess I don't remember what year necessarily, but quite a while ago when it was realized that toxicants, or not toxicants specifically, but that animals basically are more of a being, and that they can have these interactions. So it started quite a while ago, and it's gained traction. It gained a lot of traction in the veterinary field because veterinarians are a little bit more used to working among disciplines than maybe some human clinicians. And so, it really gained traction there. And then it's slowly, I think, being able to bring in a number of other disciplines. But yeah, I mean, it's been around for, over 50 years, just called a number of different things. And through that process, different regulatory agencies have also been helpful. New laws have been, or commissions have been put in place. Again, just bringing together a lot of these different groups.
Thanks, Tracie. So your surveys for PFAS, you're focusing on sediment. So maybe you can share why choosing sediment for the focus on that, and then also does it follow basically the spatial trajectory of wastewater treatment plant outfalls along the Huron-Erie corridor?
Yeah, so I mean, we looked at sediment. We also looked at water. I didn't want to put a ton of slides in maps and bar charts and those kinds of things. So we looked at both. Interestingly, they're very, very different. So a lot of the things we only see in water, and a lot of them we only see in sediment. I think that has to do with the chemical structure of these compounds. Wastewater effluent, especially in the Rouge and in the upper Rouge or middle Rouge, as well as where the Rouge is entering the Detroit River, are huge. I mean, that's where some of our spikes are, but industry is also a major contributor, landfill leachate, and Air Force bases and other things as well. So wastewater treatment plants, I mean, especially when we're looking at some of the other things like antibiotics and personal care products and pharmaceuticals, for sure, there are wastewater treatment plants is where kind of those big plumes are. But when we're looking at some other things like pesticides and other runoff, we're seeing those in other areas as well.